The 367 BCE Licinian, Sextian reforms mark one of those quiet but decisive turning points in Roman history, less dramatic than a revolution, yet far more enduring. At their core, the reforms forced the Roman elite to accept a reality they had resisted for generations. Rome could not be governed permanently by exclusion. By opening the consulship to plebeians, the laws, championed by Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius Lateranus, did not overthrow the aristocracy, but they redefined who belonged within it. This was not a sudden victory for equality. The patricians retained immense power, social prestige, and informal dominance. Yet the symbolic breach mattered enormously. The consulship was not just an office, it was the pinnacle of Roman political legitimacy. Allowing plebeians to hold it meant acknowledging that authority in Rome derived from service to the state, not merely from ancestry. What makes the reforms especially Roman is their method. Change came not through violence, but through prolonged institutional pressure, legal obstruction, and persistence. The tribunes stalled elections, exploited constitutional loopholes, and forced compromise. The result was not a clean victory, but a negotiated settlement, one that preserved stability while slowly widening participation. In the long run, the Licinian, Sextian reforms helped transform Rome's social conflict into a system of integration rather than rupture. Ambitious plebeian families did not destroy the Republic. They entered it, merged with it, and eventually formed a new ruling class. Rome survived precisely because it learned how to absorb its challengers. In that sense, 367 BCE is not just about plebeians becoming consuls. It is about Rome discovering a principle that would fuel its expansion for centuries. Power could be shared without the state collapsing, and doing so made it stronger. The Roman Republic was not born into balance. From its earliest years, it existed in a state of managed strain, an uneasy coexistence between groups whose interests overlapped just enough to prevent collapse, but never enough to produce harmony. Later Roman writers would often describe the Republic as a carefully ordered system of offices, laws, and traditions. Yet beneath that appearance of stability lay a deeper truth. Rome was held together not by consensus, but by continuous negotiation under pressure. The tension between patricians and plebeians was not an accident of early Roman history, nor a temporary flaw to be corrected and forgotten. It was structural. It shaped how Rome governed itself, how it distributed power, and how it understood legitimacy. To understand why the Licinian, Sextian reforms mattered in 367 BCE, one must first abandon the idea that Rome was ever a unified political community in the modern sense. From the beginning, the Republic was a state divided against itself, and remarkably, it learned how to survive that division. After the overthrow of the monarchy in 509 BCE, the Romans did not replace kings with democracy. They replaced a single ruler with a narrow ruling class. Political authority became collective, but it remained exclusive. The highest offices of the Republic were monopolized by a small group of aristocratic families who claimed both ancestral distinction and religious authority. These families, the patricians, did not simply govern Rome, they defined what governance was allowed to look like. The plebeians, by contrast, formed the majority of Rome's population. They were farmers, craftsmen, laborers, soldiers, citizens who fought Rome's wars and sustained its economy, yet remained largely excluded from its political command. This exclusion was not merely social. It was legal, religious, and institutional. For early Romans, politics was inseparable from sacred tradition, and tradition favored those who already held power. What made this tension uniquely dangerous was that Rome depended on the plebeians even as it marginalized them. The Republic could not function without their military service. It could not expand, defend itself, or even maintain order without their participation. And yet, it repeatedly denied them meaningful access to the decisions that governed their lives. This contradiction was not theoretical. It was lived daily, in debt disputes, land shortages, and unequal justice. The early republic responded to this problem not by resolving it, but by containing it. When plebeian discontent grew unbearable, Rome improvised. The first secession of the plebs in the early 5th century BCE was not a revolution in the modern sense. The plebeians did not storm the forum or overthrow the Senate. They withdrew. They refused to cooperate. And in doing so, they exposed a fundamental weakness in the republic. A state cannot function when its majority disengages. The response to that crisis set the pattern for centuries to come. Rather than dismantling the aristocratic order, Rome made concessions. New offices were created. Protections were codified. The tribunes of the plebs emerged as a political pressure valve, officially recognized figures whose purpose was not to govern, but to block, veto, and obstruct. Their power was negative by design. They could stop decisions, but not initiate lasting structural change. This arrangement preserved stability, but it did not eliminate resentment. Each concession solved an immediate crisis while leaving the deeper imbalance intact. Plebeians gained legal protections without gaining authority. They gained recognition without equality. The republic learned how to survive unrest, but not how to end it. By the 4th century BCE, this pattern had hardened into tradition. Rome was no longer a fragile city-state struggling to define itself. It was expanding territorially, fighting prolonged wars, and integrating conquered peoples. Yet internally, its political framework remained stubbornly archaic. Offices that had once been justified as safeguards against tyranny had become tools of exclusion. The consulship, in particular, stood as a symbol of this contradiction. Consuls were not merely administrators or generals. They embodied the republic itself. They commanded armies, presided over elections, interpreted omens, and represented Rome before gods and men. To be excluded from the consulship was to be excluded from the highest expression of Roman citizenship. For generations, plebeians had been told that this exclusion was necessary, that the gods demanded patrician leadership, that tradition required noble blood, that stability depended on continuity. Yet these justifications rang increasingly hollow. Rome's survival had depended on plebeian soldiers. Its recovery after disasters, military defeats, invasions, economic shocks, had relied on collective sacrifice. The idea that only patricians were fit to lead became harder to defend in a republic that demanded so much from those it sidelined. What makes this period remarkable is not that conflict existed, but that it endured without tearing the state apart. Other societies faced similar divisions and collapsed into civil war or tyranny. Rome did neither, at least not yet. Instead, it developed a political culture in which conflict was normalized. Disagreement was expected. Obstruction was legal. Delay was strategic. Progress came not through sweeping reforms, but through incremental breaches in an otherwise rigid system. By 367 BCE, the Republic was approaching a breaking point of a different kind. The old methods of containment were no longer sufficient. Economic pressures intensified social divisions. Military demands increased the burden on those with the least political voice. The offices created to protect plebeians had become instruments of prolonged stalemate rather than resolution. This was the environment in which the Licinian, Sextian reforms emerged, not as an ideological manifesto, but as a response to exhaustion. The Republic had reached a moment where continued exclusion threatened its own functionality. The question was no longer whether plebeians deserved access to power, but whether Rome could afford to deny it any longer. To understand why the consulship mattered so deeply, and why exclusion from it shaped Roman politics for centuries, we must first set aside modern assumptions about power. In the Roman Republic, power was not simply the ability to pass laws or command troops. It was status made visible, authority sanctified by tradition, and legitimacy confirmed through ritual. Political office was not a job. It was a public declaration of who counted. The Republic's institutions were built on the belief that authority flowed downward from the past. Ancestry, custom, and precedent carried as much weight as any written statute. Romans called this mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It was not a fixed code, but a shared understanding of how things had always been done, and therefore how they should continue to be done. To challenge an office was not merely to dispute policy, it was to question the moral architecture of the state. At the center of this system stood the consulship. Consuls were the highest annually elected magistrates of the Republic. 2 were chosen each year, a deliberate safeguard against the return of monarchy. In theory, they were equals, checking one another's power. In practice, they formed the apex of Roman political life. They commanded armies, convened the Senate, presided over assemblies, enforced laws, and represented Rome in war and diplomacy. Their authority extended across civil, military, and religious domains. Yet what made the consulship truly powerful was not the list of its duties. It was what the office symbolized. To be consul was to embody the Republic. Consuls wore distinctive dress, were accompanied by lictors carrying the fasces, bundles of rods symbolizing coercive authority, and possessed imperium, the supreme right to command. This authority was visible, audible, and ritualized. When a consul spoke, the Republic spoke. When a consul commanded, Rome obeyed. Imperium, however, was not merely administrative power. It was sacred. Roman religion did not exist apart from politics, it infused it. Consuls took auspices, read divine signs, and ensured that Rome acted in accordance with the will of the gods. This religious dimension mattered deeply, because it allowed political exclusion to be framed as cosmic necessity. If the gods favored patrician leadership, then opening the consulship to plebeians was not reform, it was sacrilege. This belief system did not require universal acceptance to function. It needed only enough legitimacy to discourage sustained challenge. And for a long time it succeeded. Below the consulship existed a hierarchy of magistracies, quaestors, aediles, praetors, each with defined responsibilities and limited terms. Advancement through these offices formed a political ladder later known as the cursus honorum. In theory, this ladder rewarded merit and service. In reality, access to its upper rungs depended on family connections, wealth, and recognition by the existing elite. Office holding created visibility. Visibility created reputation. Reputation created influence. And influence in Rome often mattered more than law. For plebeians, this system presented a paradox. They were citizens. They could vote, serve in the army, and be taxed. Some were wealthy, educated, and socially prominent. Yet without access to the consulship, their political ceiling remained fixed. No matter how capable a plebeian might be, he could not fully participate in the Republic's symbolic center of power. This exclusion had consequences that extended far beyond prestige. Roman politics operated through networks of obligation. Patronage bound elites to clients, families to followers, generals to soldiers. Office amplified these networks. A consul could reward allies, shape careers, and influence decisions long after his term ended. The Senate, often portrayed as Rome's guiding institution, was in many ways a council of former magistrates. Without access to the consulship, plebeians remained underrepresented in the very body that claimed to advise the state. Thus, the issue was not whether plebeians could participate in politics at all. They already did. The issue was whether they could convert participation into lasting authority. Patrician resistance to plebeian consuls was therefore not rooted in simple snobbery, though social prejudice played its part. It was rooted in fear of dilution. If plebeians entered the consulship, they would not merely hold office. They would gain access to Rome's most powerful networks. They would shape military commands, influence senatorial debates, and legitimize new interpretations of tradition. In short, they would become indistinguishable from the aristocracy itself. From the patrician perspective, this threatened the entire logic of inherited authority. If leadership could be earned rather than inherited, then ancestry lost its exclusive claim to power. The Republic would still be aristocratic, but its boundaries would shift. It is important to note that many plebeians did not initially seek to abolish this system. They sought entry into it. Their demands were not revolutionary in the modern sense. They did not call for mass democracy or the destruction of elite rule. They asked for recognition that service, sacrifice, and contribution to the state should grant access to its highest honors. This distinction is crucial. Rome's political conflicts were rarely about replacing one system with another. They were about redefining who was allowed inside the existing system. By the 4th century BCE, the consulship had come to represent the last major barrier between plebeians and full political legitimacy. Other gains, tribunes, written laws, limited protections, had improved plebeian security but not their status. As long as the consulship remained closed, plebeians remained symbolically incomplete citizens. And symbols mattered in Rome. The Republic did not operate on abstract equality before the law. It operated on visibility, ritual, and precedent. Change occurred when new practices became normal enough to be accepted as tradition. Opening the consulship was therefore not a minor adjustment. It was a redefinition of what tradition could accommodate. The Licinian, Sextian reforms of 367 BCE did not appear suddenly, nor were they the product of a single crisis. They were the outcome of a long, uneven struggle that stretched back to the earliest decades of the Republic, a struggle defined less by dramatic victories than by incremental pressure, repeated disappointment, and political endurance. To understand why opening the consulship took so long, one must follow the winding path of plebeian resistance and partial success that preceded it. The first major confrontation between plebeians and patricians came not through bloodshed, but through absence. When plebeian soldiers withdrew from the city in the early 5th century BCE, they revealed a truth the patrician elite preferred to ignore. Rome could not function without the cooperation of its lower orders. This act of collective withdrawal, later remembered as the first secession of the plebs, was not an attempt to overthrow the state. It was a refusal to sustain it under existing conditions. The patrician response to this challenge was telling. Rather than suppress the plebeians by force, they negotiated. The result was the creation of new institutions designed to absorb discontent without dismantling elite control. Most important among these was the office of the tribune of the plebs. Tribunes were granted the power to veto magistrates, protect plebeians from abuse, and intervene on their behalf. Their persons were declared sacred, making violence against them a religious crime. On paper, this was a remarkable concession. In practice, it was carefully limited. Tribunes could block decisions, but they could not govern. They could halt actions, but they could not command armies or preside over the Senate. Their power was reactive rather than directive. This design reflected patrician priorities: preserve order by granting plebeians defenders, not leaders. For a time, this arrangement worked. The existence of tribunes reduced the most flagrant abuses of power and provided a legal channel for plebeian grievances. But it did not alter the fundamental hierarchy of the Republic. Patricians continued to dominate the highest magistracies. Political authority remained concentrated in families whose power was reinforced by tradition, wealth, and religious authority. As the Republic matured, this imbalance became increasingly visible. One of the most significant plebeian gains of the 5th century BCE was the codification of Roman law in the 12 Tables. By fixing legal norms in writing, the Romans reduced the ability of patrician magistrates to manipulate custom for their own advantage. The law was no longer an oral tradition controlled by a few. It became a public reference point. Yet even this achievement revealed the limits of reform. Written law improved fairness, but it did not guarantee access to power. The 12 Tables clarified rules, but they did not rewrite the political order. Patricians still interpreted and enforced the law. Plebeians were protected, but not empowered. This pattern repeated itself throughout the early Republic. Each crisis produced a concession. Each concession resolved immediate tensions while leaving deeper inequalities intact. The Republic learned how to stabilize conflict without transforming its foundations. By the 4th century BCE, the consequences of this strategy were becoming clear. Plebeian families had grown in wealth and influence through trade, land ownership, and military service. Some were as economically powerful as patrician households, yet they remained politically constrained. Their exclusion from the consulship increasingly appeared arbitrary rather than necessary. At the same time, Rome itself was changing. Its wars were longer and more demanding. Its territory expanded. Its population grew. The Republic required more administrators, more generals, more legal expertise. The old assumption that a small group of families could indefinitely monopolize leadership became harder to sustain. Economic pressures added fuel to political frustration. Debt remained a persistent problem, particularly for small farmers who served in the army and returned to find their land neglected or seized. Public land, conquered through collective effort, was often controlled by elites. These issues were not separate from political exclusion. They were intertwined. Without access to high office, plebeians had limited ability to shape the policies that governed land distribution and debt relief. What distinguished this period from earlier decades was not the presence of grievance, but the accumulation of unresolved grievances. Each partial reform raised expectations. Each failure to deliver meaningful change deepened resentment. The tribunate, once a safety valve, became a platform for sustained obstruction. This obstruction was not chaotic, it was strategic. Plebeian leaders learned how to use the Republic's own rules against it. They blocked elections. They vetoed legislation. They delayed normal governance. These actions were legal, if disruptive. They forced the patricians to choose between paralysis and compromise. This long road to reform shaped the character of the Licinian, Sextian laws themselves. They were not a radical break with tradition, but a culmination of decades of pressure. They addressed political exclusion alongside economic concerns because plebeians understood that access to power without material relief would be hollow, and that economic relief without political access would be temporary. By the time Rome reached 367 BCE, the question was no longer whether plebeians had legitimate grievances. That point had been conceded repeatedly. The question was whether the Republic could continue to function while denying its majority access to its most important office. By the early 4th century BCE, the Roman Republic had developed a paradox at its core. It proclaimed itself a state without kings, governed by laws and shared institutions, yet its highest office remained effectively hereditary. The consulship, renewed annually, elected by the people, and presented as a safeguard against tyranny, was in practice a closed circle, accessible only to those whose birth placed them within an established aristocratic network. This exclusion was not enforced by a single written law. It was maintained through custom, interpretation, and control over ritual. The absence of a formal ban made the system appear flexible, even fair, while in reality preserving patrician dominance. Plebeians were not told they were legally unqualified to be consuls. They were told they were unsuitable. Suitability in Rome was a powerful concept. The patricians claimed that only they possessed the ancestral authority required to hold imperium. This authority was not presented as political preference, but as sacred inheritance. According to tradition, the right to take auspices, to read and interpret the will of the gods, belonged to patrician families. Since consuls exercised imperium and imperium required divine sanction, the argument followed that only patricians could legitimately hold the office. This logic turned religious practice into a political barrier. It allowed patricians to frame exclusion as obedience to tradition rather than defense of privilege. To challenge the monopoly of the consulship was therefore to challenge not only social hierarchy, but the religious foundations of the Republic itself. Yet this justification was deeply selective. Roman religious practice was not static. Offices evolved, rituals adapted, New priesthoods emerged over time, but when change threatened patrician control, tradition suddenly became immutable. What had once been flexible was declared sacred and untouchable. The gods, conveniently, always seemed to endorse existing power structures. Beyond religion, the consulship was guarded through social mechanisms. Political campaigns required resources, connections, and public visibility. Patrician families possessed all three in abundance. They had ancestral reputations reinforced by generations of office holding. Their names were familiar to voters, their achievements celebrated in family histories and funerary speeches. Even in an electoral system, familiarity translated into legitimacy. Plebeians, by contrast, faced structural disadvantages. Without prior access to high office, they lacked the prestige that made candidates seem natural choices. Even wealthy plebeians struggled to overcome the weight of tradition. Elections did not merely measure popularity, they reinforced existing hierarchies. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. Only patricians became consuls. Only former consuls dominated the Senate. Only senators shaped political norms. Over time, exclusion ceased to appear unjust, it appeared normal. The creation of alternative offices did little to break this cycle. Military tribunes with consular power, introduced intermittently in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, were sometimes presented as compromises. In theory, these offices allowed plebeians to hold consular-level authority without violating religious tradition. In practice, they functioned as substitutes designed to delay real change. These arrangements revealed the Republic's preference for avoidance over resolution. Rather than confront the question of who could hold imperium, Rome created parallel structures that preserved patrician dominance while offering the appearance of flexibility. The underlying issue remained untouched. What made the closed nature of the consulship increasingly untenable was Rome's growing reliance on plebeian leadership in other areas. Plebeians commanded troops, managed finances, and administered cities. They demonstrated competence without being granted recognition. The argument that they were inherently unfit for the consulship grew weaker with each passing decade. Moreover, the political language of the Republic began to shift. Service to the state, once framed as a duty of the aristocracy, was now demanded of all citizens. Military obligations expanded, taxes increased, sacrifice became universal, yet the rewards of leadership remained restricted. This imbalance was not lost on the plebeians themselves. By the time of the Licinian, Sextian struggle, the consulship had come to symbolize more than an office. It represented the boundary between participation and legitimacy. Plebeians could serve, fight, and obey, but they could not fully represent the Republic. They were citizens in function, but not in form. The patricians sensed the danger of this symbolism. Opening the consulship would not merely admit plebeians into office, it would redefine what the Republic recognized as noble. It would transform ancestry from a prerequisite into a qualification, important but no longer exclusive. Resistance, therefore, was intense. Delays multiplied. Elections were postponed. Religious objections were raised. Compromises were offered and withdrawn. The Republic drifted, stalled by an elite unwilling to surrender its final monopoly. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Rome was no longer a fragile city struggling for survival. It was an expanding republic with growing ambitions, deeper responsibilities, and far greater demands on its citizens. Yet the political framework that governed this expanding state remained largely unchanged from an earlier, more precarious era. The result was a widening gap between what Rome required from its people and what it was willing to grant them in return. This imbalance created a crisis that was not explosive, but cumulative. The 4th century BCE was marked by near-constant military pressure. Rome fought wars against neighboring Latin communities, Etruscan cities, and increasingly powerful rivals in central Italy. These were not brief seasonal campaigns. They were prolonged conflicts that required sustained mobilization. Citizen soldiers, overwhelmingly plebeian, were called away from their farms for extended periods, often returning to find their livelihoods damaged or lost. Military service, once framed as a shared civic duty, became an uneven burden. Patrician elites, insulated by wealth and networks, could absorb the costs of absence. Smallholders could not. For many plebeians, war meant debt. Debt meant dependency. Dependency meant vulnerability to legal and economic exploitation. Debt crises were not new to Rome, but by the 4th century they had become chronic. Interest accumulated while soldiers were away. Land was mortgaged, then seized. Public land, theoretically belonging to the Roman people, was increasingly controlled by elites who had the means to occupy and exploit it. The promise that military success would benefit all citizens rang hollow for those who returned poorer than when they left. These economic pressures fed directly into political unrest. Plebeians did not view land and debt as abstract policy issues. They experienced them as consequences of exclusion. Without access to the consulship or meaningful influence in the Senate, plebeians had little control over how conquered land was distributed or how debt laws were enforced. Economic hardship reinforced the perception that the republic served a narrow class rather than the citizen body as a whole. At the same time, Rome's recovery from the Gallic sack earlier in the century added another layer of strain. Reconstruction required resources, coordination, and leadership. It demanded unity, yet unity was precisely what the republic struggled to achieve. The burden of rebuilding fell disproportionately on those already disadvantaged, while the symbols of power remained untouched. The political system responded to this pressure in familiar ways: delay, obstruction, temporary fixes. Elections were postponed. Alternative magistracies were revived. Religious objections were raised whenever reform threatened established privilege. Each tactic bought time, but none addressed the underlying problem. What made this moment different from earlier crises was the convergence of pressures. Military necessity, economic inequality, and political exclusion reinforced one another. No single issue could be resolved in isolation. Debt relief without political access would be reversed. Political access without economic reform would ring empty. Rome faced a systemic challenge that could no longer be compartmentalized. For the patrician elite, the danger was subtle but real. A republic built on participation could not indefinitely exclude its majority from leadership without risking disengagement. The earlier secessions had demonstrated what withdrawal looked like. A repeat, under the conditions of an expanding and militarized state, could be disastrous. Yet for many elites, concession felt more dangerous than paralysis. Opening the consulship meant surrendering symbolic control. It meant accepting that authority could be earned, not merely inherited. It meant redefining tradition in ways that could not easily be reversed. This tension between necessity and fear defined the crisis of the 4th century BCE. Rome needed reform to function. Its ruling class resisted reform to preserve identity. The republic stalled, caught between what it was and what it was becoming. It was within this stalled moment that a new kind of political strategy emerged. Not rebellion, not withdrawal, but sustained, lawful obstruction, applied relentlessly until compromise became unavoidable. The crisis did not produce reform on its own. It created the conditions in which reform could be forced. In the long history of Roman political conflict, most disputes ended in partial concessions and quiet retreats. What distinguished the struggle that culminated in the Licinian, Sextian reforms was not the novelty of its demands, but the refusal of its leaders to accept delay as resolution. At the center of this confrontation stood two tribunes of the plebs, Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius Lateranus. Roman tradition would later remember them as reformers. In reality, they were something more unsettling to the existing order, political tacticians with patience. Licinius and Sextius did not emerge in a vacuum. They were products of a century-long plebeian struggle that had learned, through repeated frustration, that moral argument alone was ineffective. Appeals to fairness could be ignored. Complaints could be delayed. Even limited concessions could be undone over time. What could not be ignored was sustained institutional paralysis carried out within the law. As tribunes, they possessed no armies and no executive authority. What they did possess was the power to veto magistrates and obstruct elections. Used briefly, this power functioned as a warning. Used relentlessly, it became a weapon. Beginning in the late 370s BCE, Licinius and Sextius introduced a package of proposals that linked political access with economic reform. This was a deliberate choice. By tying the opening of the consulship to debt relief and land limitations, they prevented the Senate from isolating and neutralizing individual demands. The reforms would stand or fall together. Just as importantly, they refused to compromise piecemeal. Year after year, when their proposals were blocked, they responded not by negotiating smaller victories but by halting the machinery of government. Elections were delayed. Normal procedures stalled. The Republic continued to exist, but it could not fully function. This was not chaos, it was controlled pressure. To patrician observers, this behavior appeared reckless, even dangerous. Rome was at war. Administration mattered. Tradition demanded continuity. But from the tribune's perspective, continuity without reform was precisely the problem. The Republic had learned to absorb protest. It had not learned to change. Paralysis, therefore, was not a failure of politics. It was the point. What made Licinius and Sextius particularly effective was their discipline. They did not fracture under pressure. They did not abandon their demands when accused of destabilizing the state. They framed obstruction not as rebellion, but as defense of the people's interests within the Republic's own constitutional framework. Every veto was legal. Every delay followed precedent. The system was being used exactly as designed, just not as intended by its architects. This strategy exposed a weakness in the Roman political order. The Republic relied on cooperation among elites to function smoothly. When that cooperation broke down, there was no mechanism to force consensus without concession. The tribunate, originally conceived as a safety valve, had become a lever capable of moving the entire state. Patrician resistance intensified. Religious objections were raised with renewed urgency. The claim that plebeians could not legitimately hold imperium was repeated and amplified. Warnings were issued that the gods would abandon Rome if tradition were violated. Yet these arguments rang increasingly hollow in a republic that had already bent tradition whenever necessity demanded it. The standoff dragged on for years. What sustained Licinius and Sextius through this period was not merely popular support, but a clear understanding of Roman political psychology. The elite could tolerate disorder for a time, but not indefinitely. Prolonged stalemate threatened military readiness, administrative continuity, and senatorial authority. Eventually, the cost of refusal would exceed the cost of reform. When compromise finally came, it did not resemble surrender. The patricians preserved much of their social dominance. New offices were created to absorb prestige. Old rituals were reinterpreted rather than abolished. But one line at last was crossed. The consulship would no longer be closed. Roman politics prized order, continuity, and precedent. Its institutions were designed to function smoothly as long as those who operated them shared a basic commitment to cooperation. What Licinius and Sextius revealed, slowly and deliberately, was that this commitment was not enforced by law but by habit. When that habit broke, the Republic had no internal mechanism to compel agreement. Obstruction, when sustained, could paralyze the state without breaking a single rule. The tribunate had always possessed the power to obstruct. That power, however, was originally conceived as defensive. A tribune could veto a magistrate to prevent abuse. He could intervene to protect an individual plebeian from injustice. These actions were meant to be episodic, temporary interruptions in an otherwise functioning system. What the Licinian, Sextian struggle demonstrated was what happened when obstruction became permanent. Year after year, elections were blocked, magistracies went unfilled or were delayed. The normal rhythm of the Republic, its annual renewal of authority, was disrupted. Rome continued to exist, but it did so in a suspended state, governed by precedent rather than fresh mandate. This was profoundly unsettling to a political culture that relied on ritualized continuity to legitimize power. Crucially, this paralysis was not random, it was targeted. Licinius and Sextius did not attempt to shut down every function of the state. Military operations continued where possible. Religious observances were maintained. What they disrupted was the transfer of political legitimacy, the moment when new consuls would be chosen and the old order reaffirmed. By denying this renewal, they struck at the symbolic heart of patrician authority. From the patrician perspective, this tactic was infuriating precisely because it was lawful. There was no rebellion to suppress, no illegal assembly to dissolve. The tribunes were acting within their rights. The Republic was being immobilized by its own constitutional design. This exposed a deeper truth about Roman governance. It depended less on coercion than on mutual restraint among elites. The Senate could advise but not command. Magistrates could lead, but only for limited terms. The people could vote, but only within prescribed structures. When one element of this balance refused to cooperate, the system stalled. Patrician attempts to counter this strategy followed familiar lines. Religious objections were invoked more frequently, framing obstruction as impiety. Appeals were made to fear of foreign enemies, fear of divine anger, fear of disorder. Compromises were offered that addressed economic grievances while leaving political exclusion intact. Each proposal aimed to restore functionality without conceding the consulship. But the tribunes refused to separate issues that Rome itself had fused through neglect. Economic suffering, military burden, and political exclusion were not distinct problems. They were symptoms of a single imbalance. To relieve one while preserving the others was to guarantee future crises. What made obstruction effective was time. Patricians could endure a year of disruption. They could justify two. But as the stalemate stretched on, the costs accumulated. Administrative delays weakened authority. Prolonged uncertainty strained alliances. The Republic's image, both to its citizens and its rivals, began to fray. A state that prided itself on order now appeared incapable of resolving its own internal disputes. This was not accidental. Obstruction forced a choice that rhetoric alone could not. Either the Republic would accept a controlled redefinition of power, or it would continue to drift in a condition of chronic dysfunction. Neither outcome was comfortable for the elite, but one was survivable. When compromise finally emerged in 367 BCE, it did not take the form of a single concession, but of a deliberately interlocked package of reforms. The laws associated with Licinius and Sextius were designed to be inseparable, addressing political exclusion and economic pressure as parts of the same problem. This structure was not accidental. It reflected a hard-earned lesson from earlier struggles. Isolated reforms could be postponed, diluted, or reversed. A bundled settlement was harder to dismantle. At the center of the package stood the most controversial provision of all. One of the two annual consuls must be a plebeian. This clause did not abolish the consulship, nor did it mandate plebeian dominance. It preserved the dual structure of the office and guaranteed patrician access to power. What it did was pierce the symbolic monopoly that had defined Roman politics for generations. The consulship would no longer belong exclusively to birth. It would be shared, carefully, conditionally, but irreversibly. The language of the reform mattered. It did not proclaim equality. It did not assert universal eligibility. It imposed a minimum requirement. This restraint was quintessentially Roman. By limiting the scope of change, the law framed inclusion as continuity rather than rupture. The office remained patrician in form, even as it became plebeian in fact. Alongside this political reform stood two economic measures, each addressing long-standing sources of plebeian grievance. The first dealt with debt. Interest already paid was to be deducted from the principal, and the remaining balance could be repaid in installments. This did not eliminate debt, nor did it punish creditors. It acknowledged, however, that the existing system had become unsustainable. Debt relief was framed not as redistribution, but as stabilization, a way to prevent economic desperation from undermining military readiness and civic cohesion. The second addressed public land. Limits were placed on the amount of state-owned land that any individual could occupy. In theory, this land belonged to the Roman people. In practice, it had been absorbed into elite estates. By restricting excessive accumulation, the reform sought to reconnect conquest with collective benefit. These economic provisions were essential to the political settlement. Opening the consulship without addressing land and debt would have appeared hollow to the plebeian majority. Conversely, economic reform without political access would have left enforcement in the hands of those least inclined to uphold it. Together, the laws created a mutual dependency. Political inclusion made economic reform credible. Economic reform made political inclusion acceptable. Patrician resistance did not vanish with the passage of the laws. New offices were created to preserve elite prestige, most notably the praetorship, which retained significant judicial authority and was initially reserved for patricians. This was not a defeat for the reformers, it was part of the compromise. The elite surrendered exclusivity at the summit in exchange for maintaining influence across the system. What matters historically is not whether the laws achieved perfect fairness. They did not. What matters is that they redefined the boundaries of legitimacy. Once a plebeian could lawfully hold imperium, every argument based on inherent unsuitability collapsed. Tradition had been amended, not abolished, and that made the change durable. The passage of the Licinian, Sextian laws did not signal an immediate reconciliation within the Roman Republic. It marked, instead, the beginning of a reluctant adjustment, one in which the patrician elite accepted reform not because they embraced it, but because continued resistance had become more dangerous than compromise. For generations, patricians had framed their monopoly on the consulship as a matter of tradition and religious necessity. These arguments did not disappear overnight. Even after the laws were enacted, efforts were made to delay their full implementation. Procedural obstacles were raised. Religious technicalities were scrutinized. The language of reverence for the ancestors was deployed once more, now in defense of minimizing the reform's impact rather than preventing it outright. This response reveals something essential about Roman political culture. Defeat was rarely acknowledged openly. Instead, it was managed through reinterpretation. Reform was absorbed into tradition by being reframed as an extension of existing norms rather than a break from them. One of the most telling examples of this accommodation was the creation of new magistracies that preserved patrician prestige. The praetorship, established around this time, carried significant judicial authority and was initially restricted to patricians. By redirecting influence into newly emphasized offices, the elite ensured that access to power remained stratified, even as the symbolic monopoly of the consulship ended. This was not simply obstruction, it was adaptation. Patricians understood that survival within the republic depended on flexibility. By conceding at the top while consolidating influence elsewhere, they preserved their dominance without openly defying the law. At the same time, acceptance of plebeian consuls was cautious and conditional. Early plebeian office holders operated under intense scrutiny. Their actions were judged not merely on effectiveness, but on whether they confirmed or contradicted patrician expectations. Any failure could be framed as proof that tradition had been violated. Success, conversely, was absorbed quietly, treated as an exception rather than a precedent. Yet precedent is precisely what the Republic could not avoid. Once the barrier was breached, it could not be resealed. Every plebeian consul normalized the idea that imperium was not inherently patrician. Over time, the novelty faded. What had once been controversial became routine. Resistance shifted from outright rejection to selective acceptance. It is important to note that this process did not produce immediate equality. Patrician families continued to dominate the consulship numerically for decades. Social networks, wealth, and inherited prestige remained powerful advantages. The law opened the door. It did not level the floor. But even limited access altered the political landscape. Plebeian consuls brought new perspectives, new alliances, and new expectations. They represented constituencies previously excluded from the highest deliberations. Their presence in the Senate altered discussions about land, debt, and military service, even when outcomes remained conservative. In 367 BCE, the reform that had consumed Roman politics for years finally moved from law to reality. Lucius Sextius Lateranus was elected consul, the first plebeian to hold Rome's highest office. On the surface, this moment appears decisive, even triumphant. Yet in the context of Roman political culture, it was deliberately understated. There were no proclamations of a new era, no declarations of equality. The Republic marked the occasion not with celebration, but with procedural normality. That restraint was the point. Rome rarely dramatized its turning points. Change was most durable when it appeared inevitable rather than revolutionary. By treating the election of a plebeian consul as an ordinary constitutional outcome, the Republic neutralized its radical implications. What might have been remembered as a rupture was instead absorbed as precedent. For Sextius himself, the office carried both honor and burden. His consulship was symbolic in a way few others had been. He did not merely govern, he represented the success or failure of an entire political argument. Every decision, every command, every religious act was scrutinized. If he faltered, opponents of reform would seize upon it as evidence that tradition had been violated at great cost. This scrutiny reveals the limits of reform. The law had changed, but attitudes had not yet caught up. Sextius entered an office that was legally open but socially guarded. He possessed imperium but not the accumulated prestige of generations. His authority was real, yet constantly tested. And yet that authority held. Nothing catastrophic followed his election. The gods did not abandon Rome, the armies obeyed. The Senate continued to function. The Republic endured. In Roman political logic, this survival mattered more than rhetoric. Stability was the ultimate argument. The significance of Sextius' consulship lies less in what he accomplished individually and more in what his election made unavoidable. Once a plebeian had successfully held imperium, the theoretical objections collapsed. What had been defended as sacred necessity was revealed as custom, and custom, once broken, could be reshaped. Still, the reform did not immediately transform Roman leadership. Patricians continued to dominate the consulship numerically. Plebeian consuls remained the exception rather than the rule, but exceptions are powerful in Rome. They establish possibility. They undermine absolutes. The election of a plebeian consul did not dissolve Rome's aristocracy. It transformed it. What followed the Licinian, Sextian reforms was not a leveling of society, but the recomposition of the ruling class. Over time, a new elite emerged, one that blended patrician ancestry with plebeian achievement, bound together not by origin alone, but by shared access to power. This transformation was gradual and at first subtle. The earliest plebeian consuls did not represent a broad cross-section of the population. They came from wealthy families, often with long histories of service and influence within plebeian institutions. These were men already positioned near the margins of elite society. The reforms did not elevate the poor. They opened the door for the ambitious and capable to cross a previously fixed boundary. In this sense, the Licinian, Sextian reforms did not democratize the republic. They aristocratized the most successful plebeians. As plebeians began to hold the consulship and other senior offices, distinctions of birth gradually lost some of their political force. What mattered increasingly was whether a man had held magistracies, commanded armies, and earned recognition from his peers. Office became a credential that could rival ancestry. Over time, former plebeian families accumulated their own traditions, reputations, and networks. The Senate itself changed in composition. As access to high office broadened, so too did the range of voices within Rome's most influential advisory body. This did not produce ideological diversity in the modern sense. Senators, regardless of origin, shared common interests in stability, expansion, and elite privilege. What changed was the path by which one entered that circle. This new ruling class, later described by historians as a patricio-plebeian nobility, was defined less by legal status than by achievement. Consulships, triumphs, and public service became markers of legitimacy. Families that failed to secure office faded from prominence, regardless of ancient lineage. Families that succeeded rose, even if their origins were humble. The consequences of this shift were profound. By allowing upward mobility at the elite level, the Republic reduced the likelihood of permanent opposition between classes. Ambitious plebeians now had something to strive for within the system rather than against it. Conflict did not disappear, but it was channeled into competition. This integration strengthened the Republic. It tied rising families to the preservation of the state. Those who gained power through reform had a vested interest in maintaining the institutions that granted it. In absorbing its challengers, Rome neutralized them. Yet this integration came at a cost. The interests of ordinary plebeians did not always align with those of newly elevated elites. As plebeian leaders entered the ruling class, their priorities shifted. Debt relief and land reform became less urgent once access to office was secured. The Republic solved one problem by creating another. Representation at the top did not guarantee justice at the bottom. The Licinian, Sextian reforms are often remembered as a breakthrough for plebeian rights. In one sense, they were. They shattered the final formal barrier separating plebeians from the Republic's highest office. Yet it is precisely because of this success that their limitations must be understood clearly. Inclusion did not mean equality, and access to office did not translate automatically into shared power. Even after plebeians could legally become consuls, the structures that favored patrician dominance remained largely intact. Wealth, land ownership, religious prestige, and social networks continued to shape political outcomes. Elections were still influenced by reputation and lineage. The Senate still reflected the priorities of those who had already succeeded within the system. For most plebeians, daily life changed little. Debt did not vanish. Land inequality persisted. Legal protections improved slowly and unevenly. The symbolic opening of the consulship did not immediately alter the material conditions of the majority. What it altered was the ceiling of possibility, not the floor of experience. This distinction mattered. Rome did not pursue justice as an abstract ideal. It pursued stability. The reforms were designed to prevent rupture, not to create parity. By granting limited access to power, the Republic reduced the incentive for mass resistance while preserving the social order. The tension between inclusion and inequality became a defining feature of Roman politics. Those who benefited most from reform were those already positioned to take advantage of it. Over time, plebeian leaders who entered the ruling class adopted the priorities and habits of their patrician counterparts. The language of class conflict softened, replaced by competition among elites. This outcome was not accidental. The Republic's reforms consistently favored integration over redistribution. Rome preferred to absorb leaders rather than uplift populations. It solved political problems by redefining who belonged to the elite, not by dismantling elite privilege itself. Yet this approach had long-term consequences. While it stabilized the republic in the short term, it left unresolved the grievances of the broader population. Economic inequality remained. Land disputes resurfaced in later centuries. Popular frustration would re-emerge, sometimes violently, when integration at the top failed to address hardship below. Many ancient states confronted internal division and failed. They fractured under the weight of inequality, collapsed into civil war, or surrendered authority to strongmen who promised order. Rome, in contrast, absorbed one of its most dangerous internal conflicts without destroying its political system. The Licinian, Sextian reforms help explain why. The Republic survived not because it achieved justice, but because it managed adaptation without losing continuity. Rome's political system was flexible in practice, even when it claimed rigidity in principle. Traditions were invoked to resist change, but they could also be reinterpreted when survival demanded it. This duality allowed the Republic to maintain legitimacy while slowly adjusting to new realities. The opening of the consulship is a case in point. Rather than abolishing aristocratic rule, the reform broadened it. The state did not shift from elite governance to popular rule. It expanded the definition of elite. This preserved institutional memory, administrative competence, and continuity of leadership. Equally important was Rome's method of change. Reform came through law, procedure, and precedent, not through violence. Even prolonged obstruction remained constitutional. This mattered deeply in a political culture that equated legality with legitimacy. When the laws changed, they did so in a way that could be accepted as Roman rather than imposed. The Republic also benefited from timing. The reforms occurred before class divisions hardened into permanent opposition. Plebeians had suffered exclusion, but they had not been alienated beyond repair. By granting access at a critical moment, Rome redirected ambition inward. The state became a ladder rather than a wall. This pattern, delayed reform followed by controlled inclusion, would repeat throughout Roman history. It was not morally inspiring, but it was effective. Rome endured because it learned when to bend. One of Rome's most remarkable political abilities was its talent for forgetting how controversial change once was. What began as bitter struggle could, within a generation, be remembered as ancient custom. The Licinian, Sextian reforms followed this pattern closely. Over time, what had been fiercely resisted became part of the Republic's assumed order. Once plebeian consuls became a regular, if still limited, feature of Roman politics, the arguments against them quietly dissolved. Religious objections lost their urgency. Ancestral exclusivity weakened as newly successful families established their own traditions of office holding. The Republic adjusted not by rewriting its history, but by extending it. This process mattered more than the reform itself. Laws could be repealed. Precedent was harder to undo. As plebeians entered the consulship, the idea that imperium required patrician blood became untenable. Future debates about access to office would no longer hinge on inherent fitness, but on political strategy and timing. The principle of inclusion had been established, even if its application remained uneven. The reforms of 367 BCE thus became a reference point. Later expansions of plebeian access to priesthoods, censorships, and other magistracies drew legitimacy from this earlier breach. The Republic had learned that its institutions could survive change, and that lesson reduced resistance to future reforms. By the time the Licinian, Sextian reforms had settled into Roman political life, their most important consequence was no longer legal but cultural. The Republic had learned a lesson that would shape its future more than any single law. Power could be shared without the state collapsing. This was not a moral revelation. Rome did not suddenly embrace equality, nor did it abandon hierarchy. What it embraced was survivability. The Republic discovered that controlled inclusion was safer than rigid exclusion, and that adaptation could preserve authority rather than undermine it. The opening of the consulship did not end conflict between social orders. It redefined the terms of that conflict. Ambition, once expressed through resistance, was redirected into competition for office. The Republic transformed class tension into political rivalry, manageable, institutionalized, and most of the time, nonviolent. This transformation explains much of Rome's later success. As the Republic expanded across Italy and beyond, it repeatedly faced the challenge of integrating new populations. The lesson learned in 367 BCE, that participation could bind loyalty, would be applied to allies, elites in conquered cities, and eventually even to non-Italians. Rome's strength lay not in uniformity, but in its ability to absorb without dissolving. Yet this lesson carried its own dangers. Inclusion at the top did not resolve inequality below. Over centuries, unresolved economic pressures would resurface in new forms, with far higher stakes. The Republic that learned how to share power would one day struggle to control it. Still, in 367 BCE, the outcome was survival. Rome did not fracture. It did not descend into tyranny. It adjusted just enough. That is why the Licinian, Sextian reforms matter. Not because they created a fair republic, but because they created a durable one. This was not the end of Rome's internal struggle. It was the moment Rome proved it could endure it. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.